why do you want to talk about the simplicity of God? First of all, what is it? Why is it important? And what effect does that have on us today?
I'm trying to remember. I developed it in the book. So the problem is with books, it's not just that that book came out 2 years ago, but also there's about a 9 to 11 month window from when you send the final manuscript. It's just been like 3 years since I worked on the book. Um, when I talk with people about divine simplicity these days, the thing that I usually am trying to camp out on, so the doctrine of divine simplicity means that God doesn't have parts. Um, and so it's not like sometimes we'll talk colloquially about God, and you kind of get this idea that, like, well, one part of God is his wrath, and one part is his love, and there's some kind of way in which God, like, internally synthesizes these separate parts of himself. And that's not the best way to talk about it. And the reason is because if God is made up of parts, then there's these different things that can kind of act on God and influence him. Maybe there's even something outside of God that can act on one part of him. And so you're losing the notion of God as this kind of Lord, as creator, as all powerful, because you're now positing that there are certain things that somehow can, like, be outside of God and act on him from outside, um, which we don't want to say. Um, but I think part of the reason that's comforting um, is that uh, when we are suffering, when we are dealing with something painful, difficult, hard, um, it can be easy, and you see biblical figures doing this, which I think is a sign that, like, God wants us to know that this is a normal way people struggle. Ask, like, that kind of turn against God. Well, why would you, whatever. Um, when we talk about God being simple, when we talk about him being outside of creation, one of the elements of that is that God's internal life is perfect and it is consistent. Um, and it's not changeable. It's not one thing one day and another the next day, such that, like, maybe one day God's going to be really mad at you and get you, and you'll never know when it's coming. Um, that's not the Christian account of God. And so, um, what that allows us to be able to do, I think, pastorally, is be able to say, like, God is consistent. He is simple. He is perfect. Um, his emotional life, if we want to speak of it that way, is perfectly calibrated to what is good and true, and is not, like, being manipulated and acted against by other things. Um, and this is where Christianity is very distinctive, because we have the incarnation. If you want to know what God is like, you can look at Jesus. And so I think the teaching of divine simplicity is incredibly powerful pastorally, because it helps us when we're facing pain and difficulty, uncertainty, all the things that many of us are dealing with regularly. Um, Particularly, I think, in this moment, we don't need to the thing we don't need to do is question God's heart for us and his care for us. That's something that you can reliably bank on, even when you're suffering. And so, um, I actually don't remember where it comes up, but, like, one of the things that I know I talk about in the book where I think this teaching is very important is, like, when it is a situation like what my family experienced when my dad had his brain injury, um, it was very good and helpful and reassuring and comforting to feel that there was never a point there where we needed to question God's care for us. Like, that was never a question. There were plenty of other questions of how much my dad was going to recover, where he was going to live, where the money was going to come from for the care that he needed. Um, what my parents were going to do financially, since my dad was the primary income provider. There are plenty of questions that were really hard and painful that we had to figure out. But there was never a point where I think either of my parents, I mean, I know they've both said this actually, there was never a point where they were angry at God or felt like they were questioning God's judgment, because they were confident in God's love and care for them and confident that he's unchanging. And so the God who loved and cared for us when we were looking for a house, when, I mean, my mom had cancer when I was very little, when my mom was going through cancer. That's the same God who's with us now, and his feelings toward us are the same as they were back then. And so that gives you a certain kind of grounding, I think,
Mm.
that allows you to endure suffering. And maybe to tie it into some of the political conversations, I think one of the things that has been exposed in recent years is that there are a lot of evangelicals who have no place for martyrdom as a Christian calling. And so when it looks like kind of the walls are closing in on us culturally or politically, the response is not to say, perhaps God is calling us to suffer for him in this way as we continue to live faithfully and do our various things that are right and good to pursue. Um, the thought is not, perhaps God is calling us to a season of penitence and suffering for him. The thought is, well, we can't lose XYZ, and so we need to do this to protect ourselves. For your Narnia readers, it's a very Nickabrick kind of thought, which Gina D'Alfonso made this point in First Things 8 years ago. In Prince Caspian, there's a dwarf who eventually gets tired of waiting for Aslan to send help. And he's like, what we need is power. What we need is the ability to defeat our enemies. And we can get that from Aslan, or we can get it from the White Witch. And if Aslan isn't coming, let's get the White Witch. And so that's what nearly happens in Prince Caspian. So yeah, I think the when we lack confidence in God's care for us, we lack confidence in the idea that sometimes God in his goodness will call us to a season of suffering. Um, that's when we start making compromises in order to dodge the suffering that we don't want to experience.